A short time ago, I spoke to Jason Greenblatt. He's a former White House envoy to the Middle East and a former special representative for international negotiations. And I asked him first what he made of Benjamin Netanyahu's address, declaring that his forces are preparing for a ground invasion into Gaza.
Well, it certainly would appear that way. And if America is urging Israel to delay, and I've seen that reporting as well, if the urging is simply so America can best position itself to be in the region if this spreads to become a wider conflict, I think that makes sense. If there's other strategic reasons, perhaps there's some sensibility in that. But I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has no choice. The atrocities that were committed upon Israel, the murder and death of what would be the equivalent of 40, 50,000 Americans, I don't think any country would stand for that. And they have a very important mission. Whether they'll be successful or not at decimating and destroying Hamas, that remains to be seen. But I think any smart leader who wants to protect his citizens needs to do what he's gearing up to do.
Even though there have been many warnings about the complexity and the difficulty of Israeli troops, for all their superiority in terms of military equipment, in taking on Hamas terrorists in Gaza, where you've got wrecked streets, a whole labyrinth of tunnels and so on.
It's true. This operation is going to be extraordinarily complicated. There'll be many lives lost potentially on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, and hopefully the Hamas side. And that will be terribly unfortunate. But to do anything else would mean Israel stands down, not just at the atrocities and the horrific atrocities that happen, but for the threat that Hamas represents. They'll come in again. They'll do it again. They'll probably do far worse. So I think Israel is faced with a difficult choice, which is try to go after them no matter the challenge and try to push this off from ever happening again or anything like this from happening again, or stand down and, because of the complexity, let it happen again. I think any responsible leader would choose trying to make sure this never happens again, no matter how complicated the mission.
Yeah, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu talked about showering hellfire on Hamas. But do you think that part of this is the Israeli Prime Minister, who, of course, has faced a lot of criticism for failing to see the initial attack by Hamas coming and failing to sufficiently protect Israeli citizens? Do you think this is him trying to shore up his own reputation?
It's hard to tell. I never like to get into the heads of leaders and whether the comments sound more political than not. I think the mission and the reason still very much exist. So I'm less about the words that he's saying, more about what he's planning to do, why he's planning to do, and understanding that this has to be done.
What about this row that still seems to be going on between Israel and the United Nations, in particular the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres? He's put out a further statement saying that he was shocked that his previous remarks were misrepresented and that he didn't intend in any way to suggest that the Hamas attacks were in any way justifiable. Do you think that Israel needs to back down now, or do you understand why there's still considerable anger within the Israeli government at those remarks from the United Nations' most senior official?
Not only do I understand it, I myself condemned it on social media. I'm shocked if Secretary Guterres doesn't understand what he said. And the only way I'd recommend that Israel back down is not that he kind of walk it back a little bit. Secretary Guterres should unequivocally condemn what happened, that Hamas is a terror organization, and not try to justify it, which he says he didn't try to justify it, but he did. He needs to come out with a statement of an apology and saying that wasn't his intent, and he unequivocally condemns what happened.
What do you make of the Secretary General's remarks that the blockade and the bombardment of Gaza, which is continuing, itself amounts to a breach of international humanitarian law?
Well, I think every war is going to result in casualties, in tragedy. And yes, the Palestinians who live there that are innocent, unfortunately, will suffer too, the way the Israelis suffer from this. But I think war is a terrible thing. These kinds of things happen. These kinds of comments from Secretary Guterres are unhelpful. Israel does everything it possibly can, as do other moral and ethical armies like the United States. I believe the United Kingdom, I'm not sure. but they understand what the rules of engagement are, what the rules of war are, and they will do what they can to minimize casualties. But I don't think they need advice from the Secretary General or anyone else as to how to prosecute this war.
But what about those reports that we're receiving from inside Gaza, where you've got hundreds of thousands of people displaced, and we're hearing that more and more Palestinian civilians are being killed in airstrikes, even when they have moved out of Gaza City, even when they have moved to the south of the country, as they've been warned to do? Do you not accept that the continued bombardment of areas like that, and the fact that basic supplies of water and fuel are running out, Israel should at least allow a pause to allow those humanitarian supplies through?
So you packed a lot of issues into one question. I'll try to address them properly. The first is this is not a war that Israel asked for. The last thing Israel wanted to do was do what it's doing. Then you get to the next stage, which is Hamas has infiltrated the civilian population and infrastructure of Gaza. It is impossible to root out the Hamas terrorists, both their infrastructure and their fighters, without doing what Israel's doing, which is terribly unfortunate. And I do feel for the tragedy that the Palestinians in Gaza who don't fight for Hamas are going to suffer. But this is not Israel's fault. This is Hamas's fault. So again, we're sort of left with the basic question. Because of the complexity of how Hamas structured its operations by hiding behind human shields and human infrastructure, and of course fighting and killing humans, civilians, I should say, not humans, civilians, civilian Israelis, because they enmeshed themselves into a civilian population. Does that mean that Israel has to stand down and accept what Hamas did and accept that Hamas will do it again and again and again if given the opportunity? Or do they try their best to minimize casualties, warn civilians to move away, which they've tried? And is it perfect? No, of course. War is never perfect. Civilians suffer terribly because of it. But that's just the nature of what happened, and it's not something that Israel caused. As to your question about the pause, what happens when you pause is that Hamas rejiggers itself. It rearms itself. It moves from place to place so that pausing, yes, I feel for it. I wish there was a way to pause and allow people to get water and the things they need and to move to safety. But when you do that, of course, you let Hamas take advantage of those pauses. So I hope that the Israelis can figure out a way to do it in a safe way so that the civilians can flee and get to better locations where they're less likely to be subject to injury or death. But they have to do it in a way that also doesn't make the Israeli side subject to Hamas using that opportunity to reconstitute itself in a way that's going to end up resulting in another attack.
Because the United States and the United Kingdom, for that matter, have been very strong in defending Israel's right to self-defense, as they put it, defending Israel in the response that it is delivering. But we are hearing that because of those concerns, that you have literally hospitals running out of fuel, unable to continue functioning in Gaza, that the United States does want to see now some sort of pause to allow some humanitarian supplies through.
The United States, President Biden and his administration, and the United Kingdom Prime Minister, and I'm sure others, have been excellent in terms of their remarks and how they've stood with Israel. I was particularly moved by the UK Prime Minister's remarks. As far as them calling for humanitarian gestures, if you mentioned fuel, let's talk about fuel. Of course, in a perfect world, I'd love for fuel to get to those hospitals. But let's remember that Hamas siphons off and steals essentially a lot of that fuel and uses it to launch the rockets, the destructive rockets against Israel. These are impossible situations. They're valid questions. I don't want to minimize them at all. There are people suffering because of what Hamas is doing. But you're essentially saying to Israel, allow the fuel in for the hospitals, also accept the fact that the fuel is going to be stolen. More rockets are going to rain on Israel, and some of those rockets might get through and kill Israelis and do all sorts of other damage in Israel. I don't know how people choose. It's a tough position, but I think the Prime Minister of Israel's job is to make sure that his citizens are safe and not have to think about his citizens being put in danger because of the bad acts that Hamas is doing to the Palestinian people. Everybody seems to be focused on Israel being the actor here who has to make sure that the Palestinians get what they need. I think the world needs to say, and this goes back to your Secretary Guterres question, Hamas is a terrible actor. They will stop at nothing other than to destroy Israel. They're causing untold suffering among the Palestinian people. Let's focus our eyes on Hamas and demand through all of our allies and friends who have some potential influence on Hamas, let's make sure they do what they're supposed to do for the Palestinian people.
Well, that was Jason Greenblatt, a former White House envoy to the Middle East, a former special representative for international negotiations.